friends. Today we have our host here, Olena, Jason, and myself, Peter, to introduce a little bit about Olena. She's a Creative Society volunteer. She is higher education administration from Vanderbilt University, USA, and Olena currently is self-employed. Jason, also Creative Society volunteer. He is with us today from the USA, and he's a veteran. And maybe, Jason, if you would like to introduce our guests for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter and Olena, and thank you, Mr. Godfrey, for being here. Our guest today, friends, has a large and extensive background. Mr. Bloom is a former British politician and financial economist known for his tenure as a member of the European Parliament. He was elected under the UK Independence Party, known as UKIP, for some time. Before entering politics, Mr. Bloom had a career in the financial sector, in case you were wondering. Particularly, his focus was on investment and fund management in the City of London. He also has military experience, and having graduated from the Royal Military Academy and serving as a logistics liaison officer. Today, he spends his time as a vocal activist, giving opinion, whether contrary or not, on topics very important to many people around the world. Welcome, Mr. Bloom.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, let's shoot the first message here. Mr. Bloom, or we agreed with your permission to call you Godfrey. Let's discuss the mainstream media. I saw a lot of your videos and the false news that's going on. As I understood, you have personal experience with the mainstream media, critical experience. What insight would you like to share regarding narrative expressed by mainstream media, Godfrey?
Well, we have a big problem now. Mainstream media, we have lost our free press completely. The BBC, of course, is state funded via the taxpayer. So you will only find on BBC Now the state view. And that has been the case really for quite a long time, but never quite so overtly as now. The same, of course, is true of Sky. Channel 4 is a state broadcaster as well. And of course, they control the license to broadcast. So it's very difficult to criticize the government because they can withdraw your license. The deep state control the media almost totally. So your prestige newspapers like the Daily Telegraph, which had international status, and the Financial Times, is almost totally owned by what the Americans would call deep state. So contrary opinions are not allowed. Dissent is not allowed. And of course, I read a biography of Joseph Goebbels a few months ago, and he said, you must not allow dissent. And when Davos concluded, the last Davos meeting, that misinformation must be crushed, which of course what they meant was dissent must be crushed. You must only have one message. It must not be based on fact. It must be based on emotion, and there must be no dissent. So it doesn't matter whether it's health under the World Health Organization, or whether it's the expansion of NATO. It doesn't matter what the subject is. Dissent is not allowed. Climate change. There are Nobel Prize winners in physics. There are top international scientists who cannot come on the television. Dissent is not allowed. So we have to have members of the royal family, actors and actresses, and celebrities. But no real independent scientists are allowed on the screen. Our biggest shield, all of us in Western Europe and North America, has been a free press. That's gone. That's a problem because 80% of our populations are asleep and believe whatever they hear. That's our fundamental problem.
Yeah, it's correct when I say, because the latest news is there is a new law in the UK that forbids people to even speak about the CO2 we are calling sea gas, or the magic sea gas. Is that true? That there is penalties even.
Basically, yes, it's not quite as overt as that. But what it means is anything you might say, even on social media, there will be a flash up, there'll be a caveat, basically to say, we haven't banned this man from saying this, regardless of his scientific status, but we're saying what he's actually saying is a lot of nonsense. So this is the kind of problem that we have. And it doesn't matter what the subject is. Climate change is a leader because that is your basis for, as you know, for political control. You have to frighten people. You have to frighten people, whether it's a scamdemic or whether it's climate. And then when you frighten them enough, you say, but don't worry, don't be frightened, because the state has a solution if you follow the following rules. Whether you take your jab, whether you live in a 15-minute city, you must obey. And if you obey, you'll be looked after. And if you don't obey, you will be punished. This is the most extraordinary thing. Of course, we saw it in the Soviet Union, but we've now got it in Western Europe and North America. And the police have been politicized. The British used to have one of the most respected police forces in the world. I think nobody has ever disputed that. They are now, like every other police force, they are politicized. They are recruited for their ability for thuggery and violence on the people they're supposed to be policing and paying their salary. Your average British policeman now, I don't think it's different in Germany or France or North America, is a moron. Worse, he's a violent moron. And this is a problem we have.
Thank you. Olena, maybe you can ask the second question.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Peter. Jeffrey, we know that you have extensive experience in financial systems. So what are your forecasts about the nearest future of the global economy, Bitcoin, blockchain technology? What do you think people should be prepared for, and how?
Well, that's sort of possibly the most important question of the day, where we are at the moment. I managed fixed interest for many years, pension funds. So I've really had 40 years experience in the City of London managing money. I was also, in fact, I finished my career as the chief executive of a life assurance company managing life assurance investment. So it's a field with which I'm quite familiar. We have something now, I would argue, which is unprecedented. And that is we are facing now the breakdown of fiat currency, the breakdown of paper money, which has happened before, but not globally. It's happened in Germany, historically Hungary, Austro-Hungary, more recently Zimbabwe and Venezuela, but we have never seen it on a global scale. So paper money is totally collapsing. The banks, therefore, because of their fractional reserve banking system, the banks are collapsing. And since 2007, 2008, the debts are too big to be rescued by the taxpayer via government. It was a close run thing in 2000 and 2008. This cannot be rescued now. We are dealing in numbers beyond human imagination. The deficit in the United States is 32 trillion. In Great Britain, which is now a small country, it's round about 2 trillion. So we are dealing with numbers which are beyond human imagination, which can never conceivably be repaid. And the value of your paper money is going down and down and down, which, of course, on the flip side is inflation. So we have inflation which hasn't gone away. It can only get worse. So what do you do about it? There are some things you can do. You can take your money out of the casino, take your money off the table. And you can only do that in two ways, in my view. And that is to buy gold, hold gold. There's no counterparty risk. You must hold it in your hand. You must hold gold. Or there is Bitcoin for those people who can take a very much more bumpy ride. It's a more volatile thing, and it's relatively new on the block. And it depends on your understanding of it and whether you think that's a good thing or not. I am not an expert on Bitcoin, and I don't pretend to be, but I am an expert on gold. So if you are, let's say, a little bit later in years, let's say perhaps if you're over 50 and you've accumulated some wealth as a professional person and you don't really want a bumpy ride, my idea would be to hold gold in specie, and that will save you, as it has saved many a generation historically. So that would be my advice.
Well, thank you, Godfrey. And what if you are not that wealthy to buy gold? Any advice?
I get asked that question quite a lot. Now, the only good news for people with no money is that they can't take it from you. They can't steal it if you don't have it. And if you think about buying gold in specie or Bitcoin, it's a little bit the same as not having it as far as the government is concerned. You don't have it. And if you can hide the audit trail, they eventually won't know you've got it. So, yes, if you bought a lot of gold yesterday, the audit trail is quite simple. But if you bought it in relatively small numbers over a very long period of time, they don't know you've got it. And so consequently, it's more difficult for them to steal.
Maybe to ask Jason for another question about the USA.
Yeah, I'd just like to tie in those 2 points he's discussed so far, and that's the state of affairs as well as the monetary or economic situation and the outlook. And I completely agree with him.
Yeah.
That these numbers are beyond human imagination. We're trading in currencies, but no one knows what the real value is or what the consequences are going to be of this expenditure. And particularly in the USA, this resonates quite a bit, right? You had just said it's around 32 trillion, and that's plus or minus a few hidden trillion that the rest of us know about. So my question for you, Godfrey, is you've obviously done extensive amount of research. So what would be your opinion on the state of affairs in the USA and its relationship and responsibility to the better part of the world?
That's a big question. It's a very interesting question. First of all, let me just state, I have been all my life an Atlanticist. I have visited 35 states in America, 35, which is more than I suggest most Americans have done. My uncle by marriage is a Virginian, or was a Virginian. He's dead now. Who my cousin married when he was at a United States Air Force base in Norfolk. And funnily enough, he originated from Norfolk, Virginia, which is a coincidence. I love the concept of America. I love America. I think the Constitution is one of the greatest documents ever read, of course, based on our 1688 Bill of Rights.
Agreed.
These things two are joined at the hip, which is why in Washington, there is a fair copy of Magna Carta, which got the ball rolling, if you will. So the problems that the United States faces at the moment, to my great sadness, because I served with American soldiers in Europe, in Germany, and I have so many good American friends, is that the biggest mistake the United States made is departing from its Constitution. The Constitution was written by very wise men, amended as and when it went along. The concept of free speech, the concept of a free society, all of which have been chipped away at. Now, if I may be just a little bit controversial here, I would argue that it started to be chipped away at in the Anglo-American War of 1812, when habeas corpus was suspended, and editorial policy was closed down. Again in 1861, with the American War of the North against the South, not a civil war. A lot of people make that mistake. It's not a civil war. A civil war is what we had in Britain in the 1640s, where brother was against brother, father against son, for two different types of political system. It was the same in Spain. It wasn't a regionally based thing at all. Now, in America, it was the North and the South. And I'm not going to suggest who was right or wrong. What I'm suggesting is the right to secede from the Union was enshrined by implication in the American Constitution. You were not allowed, or it was never foreseen, that you could be kept in the Union at the point of a bayonet. That was quite wrong, and that was in 1861. Then, of course, we had in 1913 the Fed. The Fed was invented, or the Bank of America, call it whatever you want to, but the Fed fundamentally, which gave control to bankers, and that control has not been wrested from bankers since 1913, any more than it has in my country. And any criticism I make of the United States is exactly the same criticism as I make of my own country. It's been taken over with a sort of fascism, and I don't use the term in a pejorative way, like students very often do. They shout fascism, fascism, without understanding the concept. Fascism is fundamentally an unholy alliance between politicians, bankers, and big business. That is exactly what we have in the European Union, and now, sadly, North America. And it's kept by the form of secret police, which, of course, we saw under fascism in the 1920s and National Socialism in the 1930s with the Gestapo. We now have, of course, the CIA, the FBI, and in our country, MI6, and a politicized police force acting in exactly the same way. And this is another one of the problems that both our countries have. Great shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to place an emphasis real quick, because it's for those that watch Mr. Godfrey's interview in the future. The United States places significant emphasis on states' rights. And what he had discussed was that the state was viewed as the individual that came together for a collective agreement, which we formed a union. And so it's important to understand why we're talking about freedom of press, freedom of speech, because all of those things tie into the identity of the individual and the rights of the individual. I really appreciate as well that you mentioned to people who will hear this, the true use of fascism, right? And I couldn't have said it better, and I really appreciate you placing an emphasis on that. Thank you so much.
If I may just quickly just add something for your consideration,
please,
and a view, and that is, I would suggest that the unification of the states could only work under its original constitution, because now you have no unified concept. So, for example, California has absolutely nothing in common at all with South Dakota. Texas has, a certain degree, nothing in common with Michigan. So I believe that the states' rights, it should be important for local government. Local government is state government, and that should be fostered. That should be encouraged. But there must come a time, and I'd be interested to know the American audiences, people watching this, how much longer can the United States stay united, which is basically at the point of a bayonet, as it was in 1861. It isn't natural, especially some of the states could be very serious economies and wonderful places to live. I mean, if I didn't live in England, Yorkshire, which I love dearly, which is going down the lavatory so quickly with our mass immigration and all the rest of it, I would certainly be very happy to live in South Dakota, and especially the governor there, who seems to be doing an extremely good job. But I believe small government, small communities, and local politics. This is really what I believe in, and that's what America believed in. But I say, this isn't a recent thing. It's not a recent thing. It's been creeping up, as it has been in Britain for some time.
Yeah, for the people that might not be informed how it works in the United States, I've been quite many times as a journalist and a filmmaker in the United States. I was always, very surprised about different laws. For example, not only in state, you had federal law, you had states. In some states, you had to be 21 to consume alcohol. In the other, 18 years was enough to consume. Then you had, for example, counties. One county, it was absolutely dry of alcohol. And on the other side of the street, you see only liquor stores, right? So that is something I wanted to add. Please, Olena, you have another question. Can you take it over?
Yes, and let us move on to something that we as Creative Society volunteers are very much interested in, because one of the primary topics of our independent scientists' research is actually climate. And they've been researching this for over 30 years by now. So, Godfrey, could you share with us any information in regards to your discussion with independent scientists on CO2 and climate change issues?
Well, I was on the when I was in the European Parliament, I served for 3 years on the Environmental Committee, and I gave up my seat to somebody else because I wanted to serve on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. But I had a lot of research staff, and of course it's the twin side of the coin. The climate and finance are two sides of basically the same coin. And in the European Union, in the parliamentary system, there are probably in the region of 7,000 or 8,000 researchers of all sorts, researching all kinds of things. And obviously, I looked at it, and I had some top researchers working for me on that particular side, on both sides. And I said, just after the Al Gore movie came out, the Uncomfortable Truth, I think it was called, or something of that nature. And I said, if you freeze frame the graphics behind his head on the launch of that film, it shows quite definitively that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere follows periods of global warming. It doesn't precede it. Now, that really is the silver bullet for the concept. And if you go back far enough, you'll find, which you have to do when it comes to these matters, you would obviously find that the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide at the moment is actually at a low, not a high. So all these things are problematical for the hypothesis that man-made global warming is going to be catastrophic, which is an odd, a rather unusual hypothesis if you think it through, because periods of good harvest, so on and so forth, follow periods of warming, not cooling. So if you do the graphics and the data and the analysis of the data, and having been, of course, in the life assurance industry, looking at these matters, most people, especially people who work in the media, and largely speaking, politicians, are not experienced or trained in the interpretation of statistics and data. If they were, they would give no credence to this idea that man-made carbon dioxide is going to kill the planet. So the whole thing is absurd. And of course, we had a Dr. David Bellamy on the BBC, and I'm going back 25 years, who was a trained scientist, and there are plenty of others. Johnny Ball was another one. As soon as they said, just a minute, this hypothesis is flawed, they were replaced with political activists on the BBC. So you will never see an independent scientist with the data on this subject talking on any form of mainstream media. Occasionally there will be lip service paid by one of the big newspapers. They might let somebody on for an 800-word article. But this is the problem. Nobody is getting access to informed opinion on any subject, in my view, but on climate in particular. And of course, there's a whole generation now of children at school who come back frightened and upset because they've seen the last polar bear. I think all the polar bears are going to die, which of course has just recently been completely blown apart. But all these things are blown apart. They think that all the world is going to die. There's no future for them unless we all live in 15-minute cities and kowtow to the World Economic Forum and all the rest of the gangsters that now run the planet, or certainly the West. A bit of resistance in the other half of the world. But I don't know what we can do about it, because there's a whole generation who are brought up to believe this scientific nonsense, and it's rather frightening. There's no free debate. I'm not suggesting people should take my view. What I'm suggesting is, why is everybody afraid of an open public debate on this subject? If they're frightened of that, it's because the mainstream media aren't telling the truth.
Yeah. Maybe, Jason, you have some additional questions?
No, what I was going to say is he brought many great points, but particularly is if you're striving to have an open dialogue about a subject, particularly a scientific subject that has implications for all of us, and the other person you plan to have a dialogue with is getting emotional, well, you already know you've left logic, right? It's no longer a dialogue. Now you're dealing with someone's emotions as opposed to a discourse. And that's essentially what he's speaking to is controlled narratives all around the world in regards to this subject. And you can't even have just an honest conversation about, well, what does the science actually say? And are they trained? Like, you have to take a minimum of 8 credit hours at any university in order to even interpret the most basic graph. And so I really enjoy the fallacies that were addressed here. So thank you so much in regards to that.
If I could make a quick observation there, I saw a clip from Pepe Escobar the other day, and it's a region. It seems to be that it's a sort of Northern Hemisphere thing. Give an example of that. If I suggest, as I have done, to friends of very long standing, very old friends, or fellow club members at my club, that you have to take a more unemotional and rational look to the situation in the Ukraine, and at Santos I did the Soviet Studies course, but you have to see sometimes the other man's point of view. You have to see the Russians' point of view on the expansion of NATO, see it from their side of the fence. You cannot have that it's so mixed up with emotion. I have lost friends of very long standing, of over 30 years, who now will not engage with me at all because I'm a Putin stooge. All because I say, why don't we look at with less emotion and more rationality? And this is the problem. Now, what Pepe Escobar said, which is I thought was interesting. He said, this doesn't happen in Buenos Aires, for example, or South America, or in parts of South America, where you can have a disagreement over something of this nature, whether it's climate change or the Ukraine, and still enjoy a drink together. And, you know, you just have a debate about it. You don't agree, but you can agree to disagree. It seems in Western Europe, Great Britain and North America, you can't agree to disagree. And that, I think, is a very sad thing. We've lost the art of intellectual friendly debate. And I think that's a very big loss, especially if you look at the historic context of European culture, especially Great Britain, which led, if nobody minds me suggesting this, the idea of free speech and the Great Enlightenment in the 17 and 1800s, particularly in Scotland, incidentally, where they just brought in legislation on hate crime and things like that. So the Great Britain has led the world on a lot of this kind of thing, and we're now deeply immersed into this very unfortunate situation where you cannot converse and debate in a free world.
Yeah, what I would like also to add maybe in this topic is we're currently facing a lot of problems with the so-called fact checkers, right? And we have more and more the idea that about the issues of the climate, they're looking to Google. Well, I always say in the joke, Google doesn't even have all the answers. And Google is also part of being programmed by answers, right? How are you your point of view of maybe to come to a world scientific center that all the scientists could debate, freely spoken, freedom of speech, you know, what can be the cause or no cause for climate change?
I think that'd be very fruitful. But of course, if you Google climate change, you will not find a contrary argument to the accepted hypothesis of man-made climate change. And this is the problem, because although they deny it, and I've met people at very senior level at Google and Wikipedia when I was in office, and there's a lot of untruths about me on Wikipedia. There's pages and pages, half of which are quite wrong, half of which are quite wrong. And I've said, why can't they change this? And they said, oh, we don't have an editorial policy. They hide behind this fact. Wikipedia and Google, and they said, we don't have an editorial policy. We just cut and paste, and it's on the wall. But of course they do. They have an editorial policy. Otherwise, you would find very much more stronger arguments from experts against the given deep state hypothesis on all these matters. So type in anything you like, and you won't get it. But you see, what was it somebody said to me? I can give you two examples of that. One, an old friend of mine from Cambridge University, very old friend of mine. He actually disagreed with me on something. He said, no, he said, Godfrey, you're wrong, because BBC fact checkers checked it, and that point of view is wrong. BBC fact checkers. This is a man with a degree from Cambridge University in mathematics. And he uttered that sentence. And another friend I have, a very clever man, he's a fast jet pilot with the United States Air Force. Fast jet trains people on F-35s and stuff like that. And he restores cars. You know, this guy's a very, very practical and clever man. And he said to me, when I was saying that the jab could be, we don't know enough about this jab to take it. And he said, no, it's perfectly safe. I saw it on CNN.
Oh, my God.
This otherwise is a perfectly rational and intelligent man. I did a Smithsonian course on psychology 2 years ago because I wanted to understand why people think the way they do and why people suffer from cognitive dissonance. And I throw this one out for your audience, which I think is quite interesting. The English middle class as a genre are almost unbelievably stupid and naive. Now, I go to a pub locally in my local town, and it has artisans. There'll be sparkies, chippies, brickies. There'll be people who actually go to work in the morning and do a real job of what I call a real job. They actually do something. They're far more savvy. They're not easily conned. They don't believe anything the BBC says. They make their own mind up. And yet it's the English middle class who went to universities, who consider themselves to be superior around the dinner party table than these men in the pub. And they're not. They're not. And if you don't believe me, go to Tate Modern, the art gallery specializes in modern art, and see what modern art is called, what is there at Tate Modern, and listen to the English middle class talk about it. You could put a dog poo on a sheet of paper and they will call it art. Tracy Emin will call it art. And they'll stand round it and pretend that they understand what she's trying to do, and that's fascinating, and it's a new art breakthrough. You could sell them Wigan Pier. You could sell them Brooklyn Bridge. They are incredibly stupid. The problem is they control the levers of power. They control the civil service, the politics, and the media.
And the actions of the World Economic Forum, right? Can you elaborate on why people should be paying attention to what they are doing and how could their actions impact the globe?
Well, again, I know some extremely intelligent people. When I mentioned Davos and how they get together for their instructions, I say, oh, they're only networking. Don't take too much notice at all. Godfrey, you're a conspiracy theorist. See how difficult it is to persuade somebody to actually look at the World Economic Forum. There's only one thing I can say in favor of the World Economic Forum, and that is they are truthful. They are honest. They are quite clear that they want us to eat bugs and live in 15-minute cities, and there's too many of us. They don't mean too many of them. They mean too many of us. So they're very honest. So I call myself a conspiracy analyst, not a conspiracy theorist. It's all there if you want to find it. It's easy. And I can only speak for, I can only speak for Great Britain on this one, but I know it's true in Holland and various other places. Our king is a World Economic Forum agent, and he's quite upfront about it, and he's on the platform, and you can Google him on platforms. His son, the Prince of Wales, is. Our Prime Minister, who's also ex-Goldman Sachs. What a nasty little combination that is. Our Chancellor, the Leader of the Opposition, the Archbishop of Canterbury are all yearly or nearly every year on the platform of the Economic Forum. And they all say the same things. It doesn't matter whether it's Trudeau or whether it's Macron or whether it's Rutte, or I don't know where he is now, but all these people say, build back better, build back better. Like somebody's, if it was a science fiction program, they'd put a little something in their, in their brain, and they'd go, build back better, build back better, build back better. Boris Johnson is an idiot. All these people say the same buzzwords all the time, and they're all Malthusians. They are all confessed Malthusians. So here's an interesting thing. They also run the World Health Organization. Would you take medication from an institution that believes there are billions of us too many? I mean, the guy's actually medicating you as he tells you you're a useless mouth. But people do. People queue up. You couldn't believe it. Perhaps they are useless, but they're so stupid, perhaps they do deserve to die. I don't know.
Concerning, what Klaus Schwab was saying, that we have to reduce the population from 8 billion, roughly spoken, to 500 million, right? Do you agree what our scientists were saying, that even if we had something like 200 square meters per household, that it would be enough space in one of the states of America like Alaska, and if we would be with 50 million, 50, we wouldn't occupy more than 25% of the land?
Yes, it's an old chestnut in this country that you could put the entire population of China on the Isle of Wight. You could actually do that. But of course, what Malthusians have never got right is human ability to adapt with all sorts of advanced techniques, farming techniques, so on and so forth. And of course, there are starving people in the world, but they're not starving through Malthusian, they're starving from corruption and incompetence. And my mother told me when I was only a lad in the 1950s, she said, Godfrey, there will always be starving in Africa. There will always be starving in Africa. And this is when I was a very young man indeed. And of course, I get into trouble for saying this sometimes. It's not politically correct. It's not fashionable. But if you visited Africa, as I did when I was just a young fellow of 11 or 12, before the empire the British Empire finally collapsed, you would find in Nairobi, you could walk the streets at night, no problem at all. There was very little crime. The buildings were there, the pavements were there, the roads were there, the bellies were full. In Kenya and Uganda and places like this, you could grow furniture. So if you find now, Nigeria, for example, is extremely wealthy, technically a very wealthy country. And the problem we have now, it's corrupt. But it's not because it's poor, because it's corrupt. And so, although it gets into trouble now because it's so unfashionable, I've been all over the world in my time, as I'm sure you have, Peter, all over the world. I've met Pakistanis, I've met people from India and Africa who said we were a lot better off under the British Empire, those old enough to remember it. They say we weren't starving, there was no crime, and generally speaking, so they wanted self-government, they got self-government, and in the main, apart from one or two countries, and there are a few, like Singapore, you might, and various others, who are better off, but most countries aren't better off. And if we'd stayed, we left too quickly, if we'd stayed and handed over at a much slower rate, they'd be better off today than they are. But what you can do about corruption, I don't know. Corruption now is endemic in my country, your country, and North America. It used to be restricted to third world countries. Now it's deep. America is deeply riddled with corruption. And I find that, as it is in my country, that to me is extremely sad. I find that most distressing. A man of my age, who's seen better. I've seen it much better than this.
Okay, the men of your age will come to the next topic about retirement and pension. And Olena, maybe you can introduce the question.
Yeah, sure. So regarding to pension and maybe taxes, I've seen you speaking about these topics a lot. So what do you think are the future implications of these two, and in regards with the economic collapse that we've been discussing? And maybe you have some suggestion about optimum alternatives or solutions to these issues.
Well, I'm an Austrian school economist. I'm a member of the Mises Institute, for example, and I have been now for some years, some decades in point of fact. I think what one has to accept is that the government, any government has anything to do with it fails. Everything governments do fail. So what they should do, if you want a happy retirement, the government should take less money off you, significantly less money, so you could arrange for your own retirement. The state retirement plan in my country is disastrous. I've paid tax all my life. I started work in 1967. My pension is £100 a week, maybe a bit more than £100 a week. I mean, it's non-existent. My wife is younger. She isn't going to get her pension at the moment until she's 68, and now it's looking like 75. Everything governments do fails. Our government runs the health service, the retirement plans, the roads, the schools. Everything is a disaster because nobody in government knows how to spend money better than you do for you and your family. So they need to leave us more of it. And the friendly societies in this country, you would contribute a bit to a friendly society if you were a working man. And if you fell on hard times through no fault of your own, the friendly society would help you through. Now we have a situation in my country, in Great Britain, where it's a lifestyle choice. It's a lifestyle choice. If you don't want to work, you don't have to work. Because if you've got a couple of children, or maybe 3 children from different fathers, or whatever it happens to be, the government will provide you, the taxpayer will provide you with a house, food, and spending money. That's not an incentive to drive you out to pick Brussels sprouts or cabbages in mid-November in Lincolnshire, when you can stay at home watching daytime TV. So we've broken out, and I worked in Hong Kong for a while, some years ago. The concept of anybody being young, healthy, and fit, but not working, but paid by the state, is an anathema to them. Your Hong Kong Chinese never have been able to understand that. And of course, if you look at the administration from John Cooperthwaite in Hong Kong post-war, where he said, my job is to make sure the drains work and the police aren't corrupt. Nothing else is my business. And since the war, Hong Kong turned into one of the most successful economies the world has ever seen. But that they took a back seat. Government took a back seat. Now we're regulated, taxed, and that you can't do anything without some little man from government telling you how to do it, what to do, and getting very handsomely rewarded too. Thank you very much. And of course, it all comes out of not taxation now, it comes out of borrowed money. We have to borrow to do this. In America, I was on a ship going from Hong Kong to Japan. My wife came out and we thought we'd go and see Japan and via Tianjin or something. And we got a P&O boat, a P&O liner, with a lovely dining room and everything, all the kind of things you expect on a P&O cruiser. And we shared a table with a postman from America somewhere, Middle America somewhere, and a school teacher from another bit of America, Midwest, I think it was. They could afford that cruise. They could afford to do that. Now Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And that's through no fault of theirs. That's through the fault of misgovernment. High borrowing, high taxation, high regulation. And now, of course, we've got Janet Yellen and Blinken going to China saying, we can't compete. Well, no, of course you can't compete. And whose fault's that?
You have maybe some additional questions, Olena or Jason?
Yeah, maybe what do you think the true role of politicians should be then?
Well, the true role of politicians at the moment, of course, is to give people the impression they live in a democracy, which of course we don't. So what we need to do is, it's just an hypothesis. I would suggest that in order to get representative government in a democracy, first of all, it should be small state. So it should be restricted in America to the states. It should be restricted in my country, perhaps to the counties, so on and so forth. Also, but here's the important point, no politician should be allowed to sport any rosette of any color. He should not be able to say, vote red or vote blue. And this is how we get such a low caliber of politician, both in America and Great Britain. And they are extraordinarily low caliber. I mean, amazingly low caliber. Now, if they had to stand in front of the British or American people and say, you know, if I stood, I have been elected under proportional representation, which gave me a chance, and I was elected twice with very big numbers, because I could really, and I was an independent for my second term, I could say, I'm Godfrey Bloom, this is what I believe in. Taxation is theft, the man from Whitehall doesn't know best, and let's leave us alone and to get on with their lives. That was about it in a nutshell. And I got heavily elected all the time. Now, you vote red or you vote blue. I mean, what kind of choice, I would argue, in America is Biden or Trump for the world's greatest economy, one of the greatest powers? What kind of choice have I got with Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer? What kind of choice have the French got? With this representative democracy business, you wear a flag, you wear a label. And at the risk of sounding a little bit crude, I live in a constituency, a political constituency, which is very middle class, very rural, conservative with a small c. There has never been anybody representing my constituency except a conservative. And if you put a big blue rosette on a dog turd, they would vote for it here. Now, if you cross the river, it's been red, it's been Labour for years and years and decades and decades and decades. And it's the same. If you put up a dog turd and put a red rosette in it, people would vote for that. That's the party system. We'll never get out of this problem until we get rid of the party system, get rid of Democrats, get rid of Republicans, get rid of Conservatives, get rid of Labour, get rid of Social Democrats in Germany. What do they call themselves? Christian Democrats. Make people stand up and say, this is what I believe in. Vote for me. I'm an individual. I'll represent you. And if they don't represent you, you kick them out in 3 or 4 years' time. It's not difficult. But of course, everybody is in the system making money out of the system. Who's going to change an electoral system that elected them?
Well, you did already a good introduction, Godfrey, about what Jason would like to ask you and about the future of the UK. So, Jason, go ahead, please.
What are your thoughts on how to fix the United Kingdom's problems?
Well, we, as an island nation, we have always bounced back. We've had bad times, we've had good times. We've been an independent nation for 1,000 years. So we've seen some good and we've seen some bad. The problem we have at the moment is similar to America insofar as we have mass migration and from alien cultures. And it's not just a question of the British dusting themselves off, getting back on their feet and sorting themselves out, which it has been for 1,000 years. We now have millions and millions and millions of people who don't want our institutions, don't like our culture, live in ghettos and run their own business under their own laws, Sharia laws, so on and so forth. So this is the problem. It's this time it's going to be very difficult to bounce back from. And of course, it's the same in America. How are you going to deal with millions and millions and millions of people coming into America? You don't know who they are. You don't know what's going on. It's a really big problem. Give you an example of just not just our countries, is it? It's Germany. 80% of convicted rapists in Germany are Afghans. We have an 800% increase in rape in Bournemouth. And if you knew this country, you'd know that Bournemouth is a very sleepy seaside town historically and very charming. There was no rape until we had mass immigration. It just didn't happen. Believe me, you go, well, that's ridiculous. Really, we just didn't. And now we find 17 or 18% of our prisons are Muslim. And you try and tell that on mainstream media. And when somebody from the AfD in Germany pointed out the Afghan rape statistics, she was fined 6,000 euros. You're not allowed, and we had a man arrested. They wanted to move 150 aliens in from North Africa or wherever it was, and they held up posters with all the people who'd been convicted of rape in the last 6 months, and he was arrested by the police. They did actually release him, but we're not allowed to say, and I'm afraid I don't know how we're going to deal with it. I think we're going to have to take responsibility for ourselves. We're going to have to protect our own women folk, our own people. We're going to have to lay in supplies, until maybe it blows over. But I can't see, short of rounding up illegal immigrants en masse and shipping them back to where they came, with all that entails, that will also involve corruption, violence, and all sorts of other things. But we shouldn't be here. This should never have been allowed to happen to start with. Now it's going to end badly. It's going to end in tears. And I suspect it's going to end in bloodshed because I don't see how else it can end.
Jason, you want to comment on that?
I think it's a fair point that actually points out to a lot of people's sense of hopelessness in this matter. We at Creative Society have spent quite a bit of time interacting with refugees, survivors, organizers, nonprofits, what have you. And it's going to come down to people. People themselves have to organize and provide the structure to deal with this situation, because you actually pointed out a very important point, and that is you have these cultures, and assimilation doesn't work that way at all. You have this cultural clash, right? And the people coming to these places, as we know historically from what happened in Germany when the Syrian refugees, Germany had the Syrian refugee issue and things of that nature. You have this conflict between peoples because there's no time lapse for them to become acquainted with the structures in place. They don't have the same norms, or whatever have you. And this really will require, I think, people themselves to answer the call to this situation. And I think it starts with the way we interact with each other. And that's my opinion. And that's what we've come to doing these interviews with people from around the world on this topic, because big government isn't handling this. And if people themselves don't get ahead of it, then you are absolutely right. It will turn into a violent clash of cultures.
Absolutely. Well, it came to the end of this interview, and I would like to ask to all of you here present, maybe you like to add something or some additional questions, maybe? Olena, maybe you, Godfrey, Jason.
I just wanted to thank Godfrey for his time and for sharing his opinion. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Actually, I do have a question. What advice would you have for people to deal with the cognitive dissonance we discussed, which is one of the main issues? You know, the inability to pursue intellectualism, right? The inability to investigate and acquire their own thoughts on things and experiences. What can a person do to deal with cognitive dissonance we find ourselves in, regardless of the reason?
I think it's the human condition. I'm not altogether sure we can do much about it. I tell you what I would like to see, though, Jason, what I would like to see is the concept in schools of teaching young people risk assessment and critical thinking. This has completely disappeared from our agenda. And yet the funny thing is, we make a risk assessment every day, don't we? You get into your car, you overtake a tractor and trailer, you judge it's safe to go, there's nothing coming, you've made a risk assessment. And so critical thinking, we should say, well, just a minute, my doctor says I ought to take this medication. But I'm just going to sit down and do a bit of homework on that. Just because my doctor said so, who is paid in part, in some form, by the pharmaceutical companies who provide the medication. And of course, your doctors on both sides of the pond here need to try and do that. I have a friend of mine who is a doctor in Phoenix, in Arizona, works for the Mayo Clinic. If the Mayo Clinic tell her the moon is made of green cheese, it is so. That's what she will believe, and that's what she'll promulgate to her patients. She has no concept of critical thinking. None. She just doesn't do it. And I think the problem in the medical profession and other professions, it's a memory test. If you spend 5 years studying to be a doctor, for example, every year you do an exam to move on to the next stage, and it's a test of your memory. It's not a test of your risk assessment or critical thinking. In fact, you're likely to get fired if you have any critical thinking. All that needs to change, but I think cognitive dissonance, I think it's part of the human condition. I probably suffer from it myself in some things, you know. I don't know. We all do probably, don't we?
Godfrey, thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you so much. You answered it wonderfully. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great pleasure.
And I would like to say thank you to all the people who joined us, especially about our technical person, Vladimir, who does all the Zoom editing online in live. Thank you very much, Vladimir, as well. Olena, Jason, and Godfrey, thank you very, very much. And let's
thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, for allowing us to meet Godfrey. It was your initiative. Great pleasure.
Great fun.
Thank you, Godfrey. Have a nice day there. Stay healthy, stay safe, and keep on going.
Thank you very much.